land of slavery. Now, our God is a generous God. He's so generous. We're not entitled to his love, or for that matter, anything else. All that we have is a gift from God. A few years ago, when my grandfather passed away, the text for his funeral, for the message, was from Psalm 84, and it was from verse 11. In the message it reads, "God does not scrimp with his traveling companions." And maybe you're more familiar with the NIV wording. "No good thing does he withhold." And I really like the imagery there. And this powerful corrective to any sense of entitlement we might have, that God isn't stingy, that we don't have rights to God's grace, let alone rights to fossil fuels or fashion. God gives generously and then invites us to learn a receptive posture. God does not scrimp with his traveling companions. Clinical psychologists and psychiatrists deal with entitlement a lot. According to them, an unrealistic, exaggerated, or rigidly held sense of entitlement may be considered a symptom of narcissistic personality disorder. Now, that's a real thing. It's a very real and serious personality disorder. But in the past 50 years, it's become increasingly difficult to diagnose. Why? Because in our culture, narcissism is increasingly the norm, not the exception. And so I found this illustration helpful of me or you at the center of the universe and everything else revolving around us. And even clinically, in clinical circles, narcissism and entitlement are used so frequently that recently researchers have called for a moratorium on the use of the terms. They're just too common. They're just too rampant. They've lost their meaning. On my bookshelf is the Dictionary of Pastoral Care and Counseling. I refer to it when some of you who are very difficult come into my office. I turn to this very helpful book. No, but it defines narcissism, right? And narcissism is an inordinate, an unbalanced love of ourselves. And the Pastoral Care and Counseling Dictionary, it gives the definition that it means variously self-absorption, grandiose self-love, a retreat to privatism, and bourgeoisie acquisitive individualism. Now, I've got no idea what that last one means, but I do know that a narcissist, and sometimes this includes me, is more involved with self-love than love of others. And narcissism and entitlement, these words have gained traction in our culture because they've been rampant since human beings first fell into sin in Genesis 3. And in the end, it's the entitled who, however rich, are actually truly poor. Instead of knowing life as a gift, life turns into something that's taken for granted or worse, begrudged. And so immediately following our passage, we come to this very striking section in Joshua 5, maybe one of the more striking in all the Old Testament, because Joshua, he encounters the commander of the Lord's army, and so he asks, "Are you for us or are you for our enemies?" This kind of dichotomy. Well, which is it? And to this simple question, the angel gives a surprising answer. He says, "Neither." And the answer is so odd and so striking that it literally knocks Joshua off his feet. But it may be a reminder to us that we cannot assume anything. We constantly need to check ourselves against Almighty God and to see if we are indeed serving God in every way. That we need to acknowledge God in every way, because the day we start to assume that we deserve what we get in life, that all of our enemies are also God's enemies, that's when we veer into certain trouble. We're utterly dependent on Christ alone to accomplish what we could never, ever do. the gifts of salvation, the gifts we receive every day of our lives, they're all indeed the result of unearned grace. We haven't earned a land flowing with milk and honey. And the time to make sure we have our eyes focused clearly on that grace isn't just, wilderness times when we may be more prone to pray and think about God in the first place. But it's also true of us in promised land times, where so many things can distract us from core truths, when we're so tempted to take God for granted. And so the Joshua 5 challenge is to align our perspectives with divine reality. God worried about his people in a post-manna era. God worried that in the promised land, entitlement would displace dependence, that a sense of accomplishment would eclipse any sense of giftedness, that prosperity would edge out providence. And so it's fitting for, I think, all of us to reflect this morning on that which we take for granted. What tempts you to forget who you are and whose you are? In a few days, during the first week of May, I'll be in Vancouver for a pastor's conference. I also, as you know, hope to get a little run-in as well. And my trip actually happens to coincide with my grandmother's 94th birthday. My grandmother, if she's turning 94, obviously she was born a few years ago, 1921, lived through the 1930s, World War II in the Netherlands, and then she and my grandfather and their 3 children, including my father, were part of this post-war exodus from the Netherlands. And they chose Canada in part because of the good memories of Canadian soldiers liberating their hometown at the end of the war. Canada became the land that held so much promise. Those early years in Canada, though, were very hard years, away from family. I mean, would they ever see their parents again? Hard labor from cutting peat in bogs to, what other immigrants experienced, hoeing beets and other hard, difficult, challenging labor. Language and culture were barriers. They scraped by with little food, shabby clothes, and shelter that most of us cannot even imagine. There was a tremendous dependency on God in those early years. They leaned on their church family, which was a Christian Reformed church in Vancouver. They leaned on God in those wilderness years. But eventually, they settled into the land. They started their own bakery. The kids were put through Christian education and then sent off to college. There was this better future. I don't think my grandmother has forgotten the lessons she learned from that, well, first of all, time in the Netherlands, but also that wilderness, that immigration exodus, and those early wilderness years in Canada. To this day, I can say quite simply, she is thrifty with her money. I learned very early on that if I were for dinner at my grandparents', that I ought to eat everything on my dinner plate, and woe to anybody that did not. Church is still vitally important to her, even though she can't physically get there as much as she'd like. Devotions are a fixture. Prayer is regular and intentional. And she still seeks to make Jesus Christ the Lord of every part of her life. And some of those lessons were learned in the harsh conditions of exodus and wilderness. But they're still applied. They were still followed in the land of promise. And that faith has made an impression on me. But then I look at myself. Here I am, more than 2 full generations later from that immigration time, and compared to my grandmother, here I am living pretty cushy. I was born in a land already flowing with milk and honey. I have health and work and family and friends and recreation and sports and hobbies, and it's almost enough to make me forget the words of Moses and Joshua. So easily do I forget, in fact. The book of Deuteronomy is Moses preaching for hours and hours and hours to God's people. Remember, don't forget, he's hoarse by the end. He's got to be. Remember who you are and whose you are. Because he knew the temptation to forget God when things grew easier. And Joshua 5 is simply God's people literally at that crossroads, right? The man is done. They're now eating off the fat of the land, right? They've entered in. It's that crossroads. And this morning, I wonder, what would Moses, what would Joshua warn us about? Would they preach about the dangers of growing complacent? About the pervading sense of entitlement amongst Canadians? Amongst people in the Terrace Christian Reformed Church? Would they talk about taking for granted money and retirement and vacation time and homes? Would Moses and Joshua preach about my giving habits? Right? God loves a cheerful giver. Would Moses and Joshua ask why I haven't taught my children well about giving of their first fruits from their allowances, from their paper route, from their job? Why don't you give joyfully? Would Moses and Joshua preach to you, reminding you not to take community for granted? Would they ask us hard questions like, why do you have such a hard time resting for even one day a week? Why do you spend so little time in daily prayer? What's happened to your personal and family Bible devotions? How come you don't spend very much time with Christians weekly? What's happened to your gratitude? Now, some of us here this morning feel more perhaps like we're in the middle of the wilderness and not so much like we're in the land of plenty. And I can certainly appreciate that. But I think I dare say that most of us are in danger of the entitlements that riches bring. We're just simply rich in so many ways. We're living off the fat of the land. And so we see the challenge, right? The antidote for our entitlement. Well, it comes to us by God's grace. That God's grace for us in Jesus Christ, which we remember and believe in enacting that in our own grace-filled lives. God worried so much about his people in this post-manna era. When we have so much, will we forget God's goodness and his love and his mercy? God worries about us when we see ourselves as safely through the wilderness. I mean, every human being can grow to expect good things, to feel like we deserve God's grace, to fail to be thankful. It happens to us all. This feeling of entitlement. Actor Anthony Hopkins, who played a butler in the film The Remains of the Day, he talks about this, how wealthy people have servants around them precisely because they expect the goodies of life to appear on cue. But he even points out that the truly arrogant want to believe that they are entitled to such pampered care, and so they don't want to feel beholden to anyone for it, including the servants who are around them doing the caretaking. So Hopkins says that the rich man at dinner expects the glass of wine to be filled each time he reaches for it, and he expects his plate to disappear every time he puts down his knife and fork. The rich man just wants this to happen because he deserves it. And so he doesn't want to have to think, he doesn't want to have to thank anybody for doing for him what he thinks is only fitting to begin with. So the trick to being a good butler is complete obsequiousness, right? That ability to kind of blend into the woodwork and be no more noticeable on the fringes of the dining room than, say, a floor lamp or the grate in the fireplace. In fact, when he was researching his role, Hopkins interviewed a real-life butler who simply summed up what a good butler was when he said this: to be a good butler, the room seems emptier when he's in it. The room seems emptier when he's in it. And it's really, I think that feeds into the sense of arrogant pride or entitlement, self-centeredness that Moses wanted his dear people to avoid. Joshua 5 is the end of the wilderness test. And it's the beginning of the promised land test.